You're listening to Secrets of the Royals, a podcast about the tragedies that befell the royal family. And we're your hosts, journalists and royal experts, Kerry and Maria. Welcome to the Secrets of the Royals with myself, Kerry Parnell.
And I'm Maria Cool. Hello.
We're two journalists who work for newspapers and magazines who have a passion for royal content. And we run the Royal List newsletter and community with our many wonderful followers. So this episode, we're talking about one of the most seismic tragedies to hit the royal family in modern times, which is, of course, the death of Diana, but also sharing what it was like to be at the funeral and also at Kensington Palace. We've talked about many of the other tragedies in this series. One of the things I was very interested about is how quickly, relatively, they were forgotten to history, but also then thinking about Diana's death and how that is just not the case, both at the time and now. We don't seem to...
No, and I don't think it'll ever change. I think she'll always be remembered, don't you?
Yeah. And I think when you try to analyse why, I think it's down to a mix of, you know, her impact that she had on the royal family and on the public. And I think it's a bit disingenuous to just put it down to, you know, she was very beautiful and had wonderful fashion sense. It was more than that. She really connected with people.
Yeah. And it's funny today, isn't it, that even the Gen Zers, even Gen A, they're still connecting to Diana now. I mean, she's still, you know, pretty important to them in terms of fashion. They see her as a feminist icon. So, yeah, her legacy is still important.
Her story will continue to be told, definitely. So in order to tell her story, we thought that it would be interesting or important to go through the timeline of her death. And anybody that watched the last season of The Crown, one of the things that they did do very well on that TV show was to really ramp up the tension and the emotion of her last few months in that summer of 1997.
Yeah, and I remember the headlines, you know, she was followed all the time, which obviously, you know, we'll talk about, but, you know, she was on that yacht.
Yeah, so she'd gone to...
In the Med.
Yes, with her fabulous swimming costumes.
Yeah.
She'd gone on holiday. She had gone on holiday earlier in the summer with her sons, but she was, for the first time, on her own when the family were at Balmoral. So she'd gone back to the south of France with Dodi Al Fayed, who was the son of Mohammed Al Fayed, who was the owner of Harrods. And they had been on holiday and they were in Paris on the night of August the 30th, 1997, where they were going to dinner very late at night at the Ritz Hotel, which was obviously owned by the family. Then they were being... pursued by paparazzi everywhere at the time. And you have to remember, one of the things that I find really interesting, and possibly people don't know, is that the area that they were being chased around in Paris is very small. Ordinarily, if it were, you know, if you're an ordinary visitor, you would probably just walk it.
Yeah.
But they were being chased and they needed to get from A to B. And this was part of the sad decision-making process that led to her tragic death.
Yeah, that fatal error of judgment, really.
Late at night, they decided to leave the Ritz and go back to the apartment that was owned by the Fayeds on the Champs-Élysées, which, as I said, is not actually very far away. And this is where another fatal error came, in that they decided that they would use the Ritz's deputy head of security, Henri Paul, to drive them. Now, he drove Diana, her bodyguard, and Dodi Al Fayed off in the car at high speed, and it later emerged that he was also over the limit.
Yeah, he'd been sat in the bar, hadn't he, for a while, drinking, was it absinthe? A few other things that they found.
The group went off in the car at high speed. They were found to be going twice the speed limit through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, and that's where the fatal crash occurred.
Yeah, I think it was the 7th pillar or something in that underpass that they hit, obviously with, you know, tragic consequences. But haven't you been to that underpass?
Yes, I have. Yeah, it seems a bit sort of maudlin to go there and have a look, but I don't know. I felt I had to.
Yeah, that's
So
understandable. I think I would do the same.
yeah, we walked down and we looked at the mouth of the tunnel, and then also later on, just as we were, I was driven through it. But
Yeah.
the one of the things that I think everybody that goes to when they see it is how insignificant a place it is for such a significant.
And is it a really short underpass?
Yeah,
It's
it's
not
an
long.
underpass. It's not
Yeah.
anything. Yeah, it's not a long tunnel. It's just an underpass, and it's such a tragic thing that happened there. It sort of
Yeah.
almost doesn't make sense that she died there.
Well, that's exactly what William and Harry said, didn't they? Because they've talked about going through that. I mean, I think they did it individually, didn't they? Did separately, but they couldn't wrap their head around the fact that, oh, this is this where my mother died?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. The timeline was that they were involved in this terrible crash, and Dodie and Henri were killed instantly, and then Trevor, the bodyguard, and Diana were taken to hospital, where Diana passed away at 4 a.m. and the royal family were alerted, and quite quickly Prince Charles flew over to collect her body.
I mean, sadly as well. Yeah. It was. I just remember the whole thing at the time.
It's like when JFK died, anybody who was alive at that time will tell you that they remembered where they were when they heard Diana had died.
But I remember, don't you remember, we went to a party that night, and I remember staying up and then turning on the TV, and at the time they just thought Diana had been involved in an accident. So it was just she'd been injured. So in real time, you could see slowly the gravity of the situation until the point where they had to announce she died.
It was
a huge
incredibly shocking. And the aftermath was like this wave of grief swept over Britain and the world. But unlike anybody had seen anything like that before, I think, and immediately people began pouring to Kensington Palace, which was Diana's former home, obviously, and leaving flowers at the gates there and also at Buckingham Palace. And they estimate 1 million flowers were left at the gates of Buckingham Palace, which I know you went down there, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, twice actually.
So what was it like?
Yeah. It was the first time I went there the day after I think she died. So there weren't that many flowers there. I think I was like one of the first to put the flowers down. Loads of people milling around. And then I think I went back a few days later where it was just overwhelming, the amount of flowers and the smell of the flowers. But what was also strange is that it was the quietness as well. There was just this stillness, and everyone was just there reading the tributes. You know, there was poems left, bears, you know, the same as when the Queen died, you know, those Paddington bears and whatever. There was lots of tributes like that. And so it was just totally overwhelming, the amount of flowers. You just couldn't get anywhere near the palace, because as you walk up to Kensington Palace, there's this huge path, which is fairly long, but almost all of it was covered with flowers leading up to the actual grassiness of the park.
The events that then unfolded were that obviously when the family had been told they were at Balmoral, and quite understandably when you look at it now, for the first week they just holed up in Balmoral. They were trying to comfort William and Harry. Anybody that's gone through a sudden loss of a loved one and goes through that kind of level of grief can tell you that the first week you're barely functioning, I'd say. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't think straight.
And you got to remember, these are two kids that went to bed thinking the next day their mum was coming home and they'd see her. Because obviously they've talked about that phone call where they wished they'd spoken to her a lot longer if they'd known. And they woke up to find she was no longer alive. So, can you imagine?
It must have been unbearable. So, you know, I could totally understand that they were taking at least a week to try to put it all together for them to even function. However, what was happening in London was that the family weren't there and the family hadn't spoken to the public, and they weren't aware of the seismic reaction that was taking place with the public. So the Prime Minister at the time was Tony Blair, and he had made the famous speech at RAF Northolt when the coffin came back, where he labelled her, gave her the name of the People's Princess. And this really resonated with everybody. But people started, once, because the Queen hadn't said anything, people started to demand, well, where is she?
Yeah.
And then it was symbolised, the distance between the Queen and the people was symbolised by the empty flagpole at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
So,
but obviously that was to do with protocol, wasn't it?
So the protocol is that this royal standard doesn't fly at Buckingham Palace unless the monarch is in residence.
Exactly.
So she wasn't, so there was no flag. But obviously all around the world, flags everywhere were flying at half-mast in honour of Diana. And there was Buckingham Palace with an empty pole. So the image was
it wasn't
bad.
A good look, was it?
No.
Even though
there's a reason.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the very first examples of why sometimes protocol needs to change.
Yeah, but
protocol
also
doesn't matter.
I don't think had there been a statement from her? I don't think there'd been anything, had there? Really? Or not of any substance,
no.
Maybe.
So finally, on September the 5th, which was the day before the funeral, the family came down to London and the Queen made a very moving speech from Buckingham Palace. And she finally spoke to everybody. And
I think it was televised live, wasn't it? Which is amazing.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
it was.
She did it live.
So she was standing in the Chinese dining room, and I can read out what she said, some of what she said, which is very nice. So she said, "What I say to you now as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered. No one who knew Diana will ever forget her. Millions of others who never met her but felt they knew her will remember her. I, for one, believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death."
Yeah. I mean, that was a pitch perfect speech, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it certainly just changed everything there.
It did. It changed the way that the Queen understood that people wanted her to reassure them, that they felt that she was the figurehead and that she needed to step up and reassure people in times of crisis. And something like, if you fast forward to lockdown, and she made that beautiful reassuring speech
about we'll meet again. Yeah, that was wonderful.
And it could have come from her, because you wouldn't have accepted it from anybody else. So it did usher in a new era of the monarchy, but also of the Queen's interaction. So,
yeah, definitely.
So moving on to the funeral, the next day, September the 6th, was the day of Diana's funeral, which was held at Westminster Abbey. There was 2.5 billion people tuned in worldwide on TV to watch it, and 1 million lined the streets.
I think it might have been one of the most watched shows ever.
It was
the one.
Much bigger than her wedding to Prince Charles.
Yeah. And million on the street.
And one of them was Maria. So
one of them was, yes.
Tell us about what that was like.
Well, even now, 27 years later, it's still one of those days I just remember so vividly. From the moment I woke up to when I got home. So, I decided nobody would go with me. So I thought, I'm going to go on my own. I'm going to be there. And I got up really early because I wasn't quite sure where I was going to position myself. But I was living at Battersea at the time, which is just on the river, South London. So it wasn't that much of a pain to get there. And then I found myself, I think, at Hyde Park Corner and decided, I'm going to go into the bottom of the park there, where it's not that far from Kensington Palace. So I knew that I would be one of the first to sort of pay my respects. And also at the time, I just thought, you know what, I don't want to be in that part of the procession where you would see William and Harry. So I just thought, I felt uncomfortable with that. So, obviously they spoke about that, about walking behind their mother's coffin. So yeah, I deliberately went there. And as soon as she left her former home where her body had stayed overnight, the bells, you could start hearing the bells tolling, like I think it was every 30 seconds, or maybe it was every minute. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I vividly remember those bells. And also what I vividly remember is that it was totally silent. You could just hear the horses' hooves clip-clopping on the path. And then it was silent, but you knew she was getting closer because the silence was broken by the wailing and the crying.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
as she was passing people, yeah, it was a wave of tears as she was getting closer. So you just thought, oh my gosh, And in a way, I just had to. I never thought about it at the time, but I thought, I think I have to steel myself now because it's going to be quite emotional. And I was obviously in a crowd of people, and I think I was maybe one back. There was a row in front of me. So I had a fairly good view. She was up on the gun carriage, wasn't she? And her coffin passed, and you could see the flowers. And now that, we know that there was a note there that said Mum on it. But at the time, you just saw these amazing, is it lilies? These huge lilies on there. So as she passed, yeah, people were breaking down, and I was standing next to an American young woman, who just started weeping and just then started hugging me. So obviously, that's not a British thing to do, but I hugged her back. It was so emotional. And then we both decided we'd just go into the park again, further up, where they put up all these huge TV screens to watch the funeral. So we were sat there, and it was after a while the funeral started, and that's when I remember Earl Spencer and his eulogy towards her, and then directed at her sons about, as their blood family, they would raise them in the way that she wanted and let their souls sing. Was it? Is that what he said? But yeah, and that just ignited the whole park. I mean, that was another time where everyone burst into applause, and I think later people were saying that people in the Abbey could hear that wave of applause.
That's right, I remember that. He said, so I've got a quote, he said, "Diana was the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. All over the world she was a symbol of selfless humanity. I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative way in which you were steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned."
Yeah.
Now, when that speech, he made that speech at the time, it was reported, it was kind of shocking, and people thought it was really rude to the royal family, and
a betrayal,
taking a massive swipe.
Yeah.
But when I went back to read it to make sure we got it accurately in here, I was really surprised. It was a lovely speech, and it wasn't really that antagonistic. He did make a point of talking about the blood family, but that is how it played out anyway.
Yeah.
And her legacy was that they weren't, she did change the way the royal family interacted, and her son's futures, although I feel she, Harry, talking about Harry is a whole different episode, but I do feel that...
Well, the whole thing about them walking and, behind the coffin.
Yeah, going back to them behind the coffin, obviously they walked with the young Prince Harry, and William walked behind the coffin with their father, Prince Charles, with their uncle, Earl Spencer, and Prince Philip. But at the time, it was sort of, people were like, oh, yes, they're walking behind the coffin.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, nobody remarked upon it.
I don't remember any massive objections.
No.
However, it was pretty... Today, when we look through today's lens at it,
yes,
I think that was pretty horrific that they made them do that. And certainly William and Harry didn't want to do it. William only did it because Prince Philip did it. And then
Harry said, well, if you're doing it, I'm doing it.
Yeah, and then Harry has later spoken about the effect that it's had on him for the rest of his life.
Well, understandably, yes. Yeah. I mean, he was just before his 13th birthday, wasn't it?
It's horrendous. I mean,
you can see how tiny he was in those pictures.
So the
Yeah.
service was incredibly moving. Obviously, I think there was 2,000 guests packed into there, which was a lot of celebrities as well as dignitaries. There was Cliff Richard, Hillary Clinton, Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg,
Mariah Carey.
Yeah, Mariah Carey, George Michael.
Oh, well, obviously she was friends with George. She's
Tom
great
Cruise,
friends.
Clive James, Nicole Kidman.
Yeah,
And then obviously Elton John, who reprised his song
Candle in the
Wind
yes.
for Diana, which went to number 1.
Oh yes, yeah, and all the profits went to her charity in the end, didn't it?
Yeah. So she was buried. Her body was taken back to Althorpe, the family estate in Northamptonshire, and she was buried on an island, a private island there on the estate. Visitors. The estate is sometimes open, and interestingly, the estate is actually even rented out sometimes.
Oh yes, that's true. We wrote about that in our newsletter, didn't we?
Yeah. So you want a really luxury holiday. But any Diana fans, you can't go to
that's strictly family only.
William and Harry have been back there. Harry was there recently, pictured with his uncle. So
he stayed there recently, didn't he? Yes. And also, Earl Spencer chatted recently about the fact that he's got a canoe that he uses to get to the lake. And I think he's called it Duchess because that was his nickname for his sister. That's really sweet.
It's incredibly sad.
Yeah. And obviously, she was only 36. Let's not forget that.
No.
You know, that's just unbelievably young. Yeah.
So Diana, the legacy that she left on the royal family, so 27 years after death on
August the 31st, 1997. Yeah.
27 years later, I think we can all safely say that her legacy continues and doesn't show any sign of waning.
No, not at all. I mean,
basically, she'd been very vocal about her sons understanding real life, and so to that event had taken them to homeless charities, a Centre Point, which William still supports.
Yeah.
She
had days out at fun parks.
Yeah, she'd been a normal mother. She went to
as normal as you can be when you're a royal. Yeah, totally.
So she took them to fun parks and was pictured on the log flume.
Yeah. That picture is so sweet.
Yeah. She participated in parents' races at school.
Oh yes, those videos you can watch them online. Yeah.
She did things like when she met the public at events, she would hug people, she would crouch down, she would hug children. Now that seems really normal now when you look at pictures of Catherine or Meghan or any of the other women in the royal family, but it wasn't normal then. It was completely, it hadn't been that long since the Queen had done her first walkabout when she was on tour.
And when was that?
In New Zealand and Australia.
Right.
Yeah, the first time they did it was in 1970.
Oh wow! That wasn't that long ago.
This was the first instance that the royal family had thought to actually go and greet people,
just real people who waited hours to see them.
So it was only 10, 11 years later that Diana came along and then was hugging everyone. So it seems not important now, but it was a big change.
But also, is it true that she then, because obviously all the royals used to just wear gloves, didn't they?
Yeah, to be honest though, that was, they did, but that was also a change in time and
fashion,
society.
Yeah.
So they did wear gloves, yes, and Diana famously didn't wear gloves, touched people, embraced AIDS patients.
Yeah.
Which was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
She knew
the power of what her statement would be.
She really was.
Yeah.
Her other legacies that she left were her campaigning for things like mine clearing.
Well, that was just she walked through that minefield a few months before she was killed.
And again, you have to remember that it's not a very royal thing to do to get that involved with charities that possibly now we have Camilla is a great supporter of domestic violence charities, but back then it wasn't, you didn't really get your hands dirty and you didn't talk about very difficult charities. So Diana did change that too. She also had a vocal love of the USA, and the USA absolutely loved Diana. And that was her butler, Paul Burrell, later suggested that she had told him that she wanted to move there.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah. So,
and she also famously had that auction, didn't she, of her dresses?
She auctioned her dresses just shortly before she passed away in New York, which was unbelievably prescient. I mean, she was doing it to make a new start. She auctioned off all her clothes she'd worn on formal occasions, and then she was going into a new era. Did she know?
It was the start of a new chapter of her life. A year before, she just had divorced from Charles, had just been finalised.
Yeah.
She had all these great plans, didn't she? As a new era of Diana, which sadly never came to fruition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the life, the loves, and the tragedy of Diana.
I know. And it's, well, arguably a royal, the likes of which we'll never see again, I should say. Really?
Yeah.
I mean, she was
a seismic force in the royal family.
Yeah.
And yes, I think she'd be pleased with her legacy. Her death did bring in the changes that she dreamed of.
Yeah. I think you're right.
So that's it from us.
Yeah. And thank you for following us.
And until next time.
Yeah, until next time. Well, thank you, Carrie. It's been very interesting.
Wizards, my partner in crime. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do share with your friends and subscribe to the Royal List newsletter over on Substack.